I'm looking forward very much to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Willy Shih of Harvard Business School. Professor Shih is the Robert and Jane Cizik Baker Foundation Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. He's taught there for the past 17 years. Prior to that, he worked in the computer and consumer electronics industry for 28 years. He sits on the Department of Commerce's Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness and its Industrial Advisory Committee on the CHIPS and Science Act. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, Committee on Personal Protective Equipment for Workplace Safety and Health. Quite a few titles, quite an esteemed speaker we have. His research focus at HBS is on manufacturing competitiveness and global supply chain evolution. Recently, he's also done a fair amount of work on the energy transition to renewable energy. Less recently than that, Professor Willy Shih was an undergraduate here at MIT in course 5 and 7. So welcome back, Professor Shih. It's our pleasure to have you. Please join me in a round of applause for our next speaker.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So what I'm going to try to do is tie together a number of things. One of the things Julie mentioned in the invitation is make sure you talk about manufacturing in China. Okay, so I'm going to try to incorporate some of that. So what I'm going to talk about today, first is there's really a very changing consensus on global trade, okay? And I would argue that China manufacturing is a big driver of that changing policy narrative. Obviously, between all the geopolitical issues and COVID, it was a wake-up call, okay? And then, so I'm gonna argue that there's really changing assumptions around tradability and kind of unpriced assumptions that go into that equation. And then finally, I'll just give you some of my thoughts on kind of opportunity in that regard. So the changing consensus on global trade. Well, you know, everybody's familiar with David Ricardo, the Ricardian model of, you know, comparative advantage and, you know, you're better at this, I'm better at that. If we trade, we're all better off, okay? I would argue that one of the things that is like, first, we can't assume free trade and open markets if different countries play by different rules, okay? And a lot of people are starting to think more about that. The other thing it doesn't recognize, this was, David and I were talking about this, the last time you invited me here to talk was when we had this paper on industrial commons and restoring American competitiveness. Actually, I got a call from somebody in the House of Representatives. It's like, you wrote this paper in 2009. It's like, yeah, okay. That was a while ago, yeah, right. Okay, so anyways, so there's gonna be, I'm gonna talk a little bit about industrial policy. First, let me highlight that industrial policy has a long history. There are some notable successes in industrial policy. I would argue Airbus, for example, is probably premier example of industrial policy. I've never been a great fan of industrial policy. Richard knows this because I've told him this, and now I'm working on industrial policy. Okay, but nonetheless, there we are. China manufacturing has really been changing this whole policy narrative in my mind. Okay, you see the growth in world trade since World War II. What is it, 45x volume growth from 1950 to 2022. Okay, that inflection point was when China really became a major factor in world trade. Okay, now I'm going to give you a snapshot of why I think China manufacturing has been so successful, so effective. This is going to go back. First, I'm going to start with a case study. You know, when I first got to Harvard, I was always fascinated with the Chinese motorcycle industry. It's like, okay, so I'm going to go to Chongqing and study the motorcycle industry. Now, this is a map, a historical map. Chongqing is right here in the middle. Chongqing is right here in the middle, wartime capital during World War II, right? So that meant a lot of armaments and munitions makers. Okay, so I go there because I had heard that, you know, the motorcycle industry had gotten started on counterfeiting. Okay, well, it turns out in the 1980s, the Communist Party in Chongqing said, okay, guys, Cold War's over, go make civilian goods. And say, okay, we'll make motorcycles, all right? So in inimitable, centrally planned fashion, they set up hundreds of companies, each of whom made one part of the motorcycle. It's like, how can that possibly work? It's like, oh, no problem. You know, we had standards. We had the Honda standard, Yamaha standard, and Suzuki standard, which means they bought one of each, put them on a CMM table, you know, and then each household would make one part. Oh, what kind of business was that? Oh, it's a terrible business. There's no differentiation at all. Of course, no, there's no differentiation. You're all using the same parts and making the same motorcycles, okay? So, you know, low gross margin. Then they take me down to the factory. Okay, right? I should say, actually, before I went down to the factory, what are you going to do about it? Oh, we're going to invest in innovation. They take me up to the lab. Okay, I go through the lab. You can see the whole progression from AutoCAD to Unigraphics to they were doing Pro Engineer and 3D solid modeling and all that. And just a little off to the center of the lab is a brand new Yamaha motorcycle. It's like, oh, all you guys know how to do is copy, And so then they take me down to the production line. Okay, this is a company video from that time. They're making motorcycles like there's no tomorrow, okay? And so I asked my guy, it's like, by the way, how much do these motorcycles cost? He said, oh, it was the equivalent of $800. And how much did that Yamaha in the lab cost? $6,000 at the time. It's like, oh, so I'm a poor Chinese farmer. You know what? I'm going to take the $800 one. He says, yeah, damn Chinese consumers never change the oil of the motorcycle. When the engine seizes, they just buy a new one. Okay, now, the thing that I took away from this, like I said, this is probably the most influential case on my thinking that I ever wrote, is they had somebody who was buying inferior product, okay, and giving the company the cash flow to learn, okay, and that's how they drove down the learning curve. We heard from this Dan earlier on batteries, right? On the learning curve, it was giving them the cash flow to learn, okay? It's like, so $800 for $6,000. By the way, if you go to Home Depot today, and see these MTD lawnmowers and generators, came from these guys, okay? So that's kind of one of the stories. Okay, now here, this is BYD, okay? Okay, and a little more about
R&D on electric vehicles. But the first few years, BYD produced regular internal combustion vehicles. Yeah. In 2005, we came up with the F3. It's a model that basically, speaking of copycat, it's a Toyota Corolla. Yeah. There was a lot of criticism on BYD.
Okay, so this person there actually sent me an email this morning. Okay, she said this was 2016. It's 8 years ago, right? We had visited BYD's factory. I'm gonna keep going. Okay, more on the BYD factory in a second.
These tall buildings here are for the workers. So 4 guys sharing one room in the.
Actually, if you could kill the audio, what I'll do is I'll narrate this. Okay, so what you see here, okay, this is typical Chinese manufacturing model. You have the factory here, over here the red buildings. The red buildings were dormitories. What they did, these guys made leather recliners. All right, this is a warehouse. That warehouse, 1 million cowhides in it. Okay, and so what they're doing is making recliners, and they would fill 160 40-foot containers of leather recliners per day. Okay, just to give you this sort of scale and scope in Chinese manufacturing. Okay, let's move on to another example. Okay, this is the other thing. What you find in Chinese manufacturing is these guys have what's called the latecomers advantage. This is the Geely factory in Hangzhou, east of Hangzhou, right? When you build a new factory, you get the latest tools. Like when Ford built their factory in Chongqing, it was the most modern Ford factory in the whole network, okay? So you have this latecomers advantage. So you have the latest tools and things. So then the other thing that is going on in all this Chinese manufacturing is I would argue a lot of people don't really understand what is the dynamic here, right? Because what you have is a central government that sets, they'll set national goals, right? They'll do the goal setting, and then you have all these regions who are in competition with each other, okay, which kind of fosters a marketplace of ideas, right? So you have different regions competing with each other for that auto plant or that semiconductor plant, right? And so it's a very unique combination of planning and policy as well as harnessing market forces. Okay, so out of this, this is, by the way, historically been driven by real estate funding. Okay, so it's gonna be really interesting to see what happens now. There's just this European report, EU report that came out April 10th, which talks about industrial policy compared with Japanese development plans. What you see is really encouraging this decentralization, market competition, okay? And it tends to promote certain SOEs to become national champions, but also when local authorities identify, oh, we want this strategic industry, they'll go invest in that. Let me give you an example of what happens. I was visiting Hefei in capital of Anhui province. Anybody been to Hefei? It's like, it's a nice place, but it's in the middle of nowhere, okay? And so I show up in Hefei because I got invited to the dedication of this fab, okay? This is a Gen 10.5 LCD fab. That's 1.6 kilometers long, that building, 450,000 square meters, class 100 clean room, okay? And what they do is they make LCD displays. Willy to the chairman, why is this factory in Hefei? All your workers want to live in Beijing or Shanghai. We only build factories where we receive a subsidy. This is a $6 billion fab. What do you think the subsidy level was? 85%. Okay, so, this is obviously the design and layout and stuff like that. LCD displays, this is a sheet of glass the size of a king-size bed, 0.5 millimeter thick. I'm going to align 2 sheets with LCD filler in between to precision of 1 micron. Okay, so this is not labor-intensive manufacturing. Okay, and this is because I can buy the tools and so on, and the rest of this video will show you more of that. It also says that I can invest in longer-term projects. This was in January 2016. I brought a class. See, I bring classes on tours. That's how I get into all these places. Okay, this is another HBS class. This is 2016. I wanted to see the Comac factory. Okay, Comac is a C919, right? If it weren't for all of Boeing's self-inflicted troubles, Comac just booked another order for 100 airplanes yesterday. So they're up to 330 orders, I think, on the Comac C919. Okay, so you see they have the ability to invest in stuff like that. Let me show you one other thing, which will give you a notion of this. You hear about the new quality productive forces. On the top, we have Jinko Solar. This is their corporate website. Top left, this is where they pull single crystal silicon boules, okay, using Kozlowski process for making, single crystal silicon. I don't know if you've ever seen a factory like that. The scale of this is staggering. Okay, on the right is where they make solar cells. On the lower left, that is CATL's battery factory. On the lower right, that's BYD's LFP factory in 2016, which we went and visited. Okay, so what you see is this really overinvestment in capacity. That partly driving down the learning curve. That's why they're so far ahead. Okay, but you see stuff like that. So these types of things, and then now we have China's dual circulation strategy, which says, I have my internal circulation and my external circulation. The goals really are, what I want to be able to do is I want to increase global trade, and I want the world to depend on me for critical technologies. Okay, I'd like to stimulate domestic consumption, and I'd like to keep my capital account closed. Well, you get to pick, this is like the triangle we saw earlier, right? You get to pick 2 out of 3. The domestic consumption is a part of this falling down now. But what you end up with is you end up with things like, tremendous growth in semiconductor capacity. This only goes up to 2016. This is from TrendForce. If you look at TrendForce, says 60% of China's chip manufacturing capacity may come online in the next 3 years. And you see how much capacity they're bringing online. As the US restricted access to the leading edge nodes, a lot of that investment flowed into trailing edge, 14 nanometer and above. So it'll be 28 nanometer, it'll be 40, 45, what have you, even 65, even 90 nanometer which will get totally commoditized, okay? And so what you see is you see this wave of exports, which I would argue is really triggering a lot of this industrial policy stuff. This is not going to go well, right? We're now seeing in Europe sort of the same type of problem. Richard is smiling here, okay? But, so we're seeing a lot more sensitivity on those types of things. Then, of course, we have the disruptions from first, this one a lot of people didn't pay attention to, but this was the 2011 Tohoku, East Japan earthquake and tsunami. Companies like Toyota at that point said, gee, we're reliant on a geologically and geopolitically unstable region of the world for a lot of our chips. We better have more inventory. Okay, and they made that decision back in 2011, which meant they needed to carry more safety stock to reflect that, because they said we really have longer lead time. And that was one of the reasons they were so much better prepared compared to everybody else. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic. Okay, so, I would argue that we're really at a unique time in recent history in terms of economic disruption, the shortages it caused, this whole push for strategic and technical sovereignty and stimulus spending. So now the question is like, how do I strike this balance between efficiency and resiliency and more diversified sourcing? Okay, and so we're also seeing, this is the key question in my mind. It's like when you outsource from a high-cost country to a low-cost country, your savings are so dramatic that it'll pay for itself very quickly. Okay, but when you go from a low-cost country to a high-cost country, does it work? So I would argue that we should really be rethinking the whole notion of tradability, right? Historically, this has been just driven by labor cost arbitrage. I remember doing this. It used to cost me $80 to assemble a product in upstate New York. I could do it for $38 in Japan. I could do it for $2.32 in China. Okay, with numbers like that, I could get the payback on building the plant, training, hiring all the people, training everybody. I could get a payback in a year, easy. Okay, but when you go the other direction, it doesn't work. The problem with this is I would argue that there are a lot of things that are unpriced in this, which is risk of disruption, and now increasingly carbon footprint and environmental costs, right? So unpriced risk, we see the kind of geopolitical disruptions, we see climate risk, we see regulatory risk. I'm going to give you an example on that in a moment. And in terms of geopolitics, of course, we now see strong industrial policy initiatives, not only in the US, but also in Europe, in Japan, Korea, a lot of other countries, okay, which are changing that equation. So it'll change the course of a lot of supply chains, in my view, over time. I think it's going to take a lot longer than a lot of people think, okay, but I think it's still a little underappreciated, the breadth and depth of dependency on imports. I was talking to somebody in the construction industry, those nail guns that you use for firing nails when you're putting in roofing and sheetrock. He said, remember when Beijing shut down all industries in preparation for the Olympics? It's like you couldn't get nails, right? So, we always rely on these little events to surface all these things. So there's kind of a tendency to look one stage up or down in the supply chain. We don't see the big picture. Some general thoughts. I think US domestic supply chains can be rebuilt. Longer question is going to be on cost, and do we understand how skills and all those things flow into adjacencies? Okay. During the pandemic, we have this factory simulation in Harvard Business School. And I said, well, we can't run the simulation of the pandemic. It's like, how about if we set up a mask factory and we'll have students work in the mask factory? You know what? I could order a mask making machine from China delivered in 60 days because they're tool builders, okay? If you ordered one from Germany, it took 6 months, okay? So all that other stuff that goes with it, right? So just quickly, I want to talk about climate regulatory impact. I don't think a lot of people have focused on this. IMO 2023 regulations were around, let's talk about container shipping, because I went and did a study on this. Starting January 1st, 2023, you have to calculate your annual efficiency ratio and your carbon intensity indicator. Annual efficiency ratio, I won't bother you with this, but is fuel consumption times CO2 emission factor divided by deadweight tonnage and distance traveled. And then what happens is your ship is graded every year, A, B, C, D, or E. All right. If you're graded D, you have 3 years to remediate it. If you're graded E, you have 1 year to remediate. After that, you cannot operate it in international trade. Okay. By the way, the targets get 2% harder every year. So I think next year, 70% of all container ships will not be compliant. So now we have the EU emissions trading scheme. And if you take these two things and combine them, it's going to have an impact on service design. I'm going to show you, the next chart will show you an example of that. When I combine that with the European Carbon Border Adjustment scheme, which they're starting to implement as well, it's going to impact location choices where it makes sense to ship things. Now, if you go to the IMO regulations, right, and you do the math, what you find out that these service loops that go a lot of stops, like we'll stop in Busan, then Shanghai, Ningbo, Xiamen, Yantian, and then come back to the US West Coast. You can't afford to do that anymore. Okay, what I want is long direct service routes, okay? So you're gonna see things like on route planning and rotation optimization. Maybe what I wanna do is and one of the big container shipping companies, I've gotten to know several of the big container shipping companies. One of them said, we may not be able to provide service to some of the smaller routes. So I mean, all these things are gonna have a factor in what's gonna be my ideal location choice? Where do I wanna locate things? And you know, so, oh, by the way, if you're gonna sail from Singapore to Rotterdam, you're now going to pay for the emissions on that route. So what you want is an optimal fuel choice, largest ship possible, with the highest load factor possible. By the way, Maersk just announced they're going to go to a hub and spoke system, and everybody else in the industry is saying, that doesn't make any sense at all. If you do this emission calculation, it totally makes sense, okay? And people haven't figured that out yet, okay? So just things to pay attention to. Regionalization, we'll see more regionalization, I think. Logistics, you know, when we teach about supply chains, we always think about, well, here's your manufacturer, here's your suppliers. We don't consider the logistics links in between, okay? I think that is gonna change. Decarbonization and sustainability, I think is gonna have a bigger impact, which can be both positive and negative than a lot of people realize. And supplier health is another. I think anytime you have change, there's opportunity. I'm very keen on process innovation, right? If I'm gonna compete with what we see in China, I have to do it a different way. I can't do it the way they're talking about there. I think application of data, machine learning, AI to production processes, and that kind of goes with the last thing, is to the extent that I can apply first principles. To the extent we can make manufacturing more of a software problem, it plays to our strengths. So anyways, just closing thought, change. I was looking for quotes from about change. This was from Kennedy in 1963, which I thought was pretty good. Change is the law of life. Those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss the future. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but you have to recognize all the change in the environment. Okay, questions?
Hello, thank you very much. You talked a bit in your presentation about a lot of the advantages of manufacturing being moved to China, specifically the lower wage costs, the advantages of scale in that economy, the higher government subsidies. But as we reminisce on the COVID pandemic and a lot of the supply chain disruptions that brought, I believe a previous speaker talked about how a 10-day disruption could create further complications for a company stretching out into months. There seems to be a trend that I'm observing of a lot of companies saying, you know, look, we recognize the advantages of the Chinese and Asian manufacturing market, but with this riskier environment, maybe we should look closer to home, closer to America, specifically in Latin America, Brazil, and Mexico. Can
Right.
you comment on that at all and
Yeah.
what that means for
Yeah,
manufacturing?
there was just a news release yesterday from Costco and OOCL, which is a Hong Kong-based subsidiary of Costco, that they're establishing a direct service from Asia, Qingdao in particular, Qingdao, Ningbo, Shanghai, to Mexican ports. Okay, if you look at the growth of cargo traffic from China to Mexico, it's the highest growth rate of anywhere. Okay, and so what you also see is you see Chinese companies saying, I gotta avoid, I have to diversify as well, so I'm gonna get closer to the market, so I'm gonna move into Mexico, right? A lot of controversy around U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, and is that going to be in compliance with that? I think your point, though, really is that was all the unpriced risk, and then what the pandemic suddenly showed is like, hey, guess what? It costs something. Okay. Now the real question is, will people pay for resilience over time? Okay, already on, will people pay for lower carbon emissions? Okay, so you have, because they're the same thing, right? Because carbon emissions are unpriced as well. Toyota is my point on Toyota, right? They have redefined lead time to reflect risk in the supply chain. It cost them more, served them very well during the pandemic. They lasted like 6 months longer than General Motors or Ford or anybody. Okay, so yeah, that's real. People are starting to recognize it. The real question is, will people pay for it? I'm kind of pessimistic.
Thank you for the presentation. It was super. I'm going to try to figure out my question while I'm talking because I've been thinking about this a lot, and your presentation really sparked some thoughts. So I think you made the example of the Yamaha or Suzuki motor being 10 times more expensive compared to the subsidized, regional manufacturing in China, and that is obviously the like more longer term, like we've been seeing. The copycat model and lower costing, and that's what China's been known for a long time. I'm seeing something. So a little bit of context here. We'll talk about this in a second, but my company makes 3D printers, and we have a lot of Chinese competition, lower cost Chinese competition. I'm seeing something pretty different compared to those 1980s, 1990s,
Yeah,
and I see amazing entrepreneurs.
absolutely. Okay, so I want to agree with you because that was an old example.
Yeah.
Okay, and and Ling Soo Kim wrote this book. The title is From Imitation to Innovation. Okay, which is I'm going to learn from innovation. Okay, or I'm going to learn from imitation. By the way, open source software is a great way to learn as well, right? Because all the great operating systems of the world are written within 100 miles of the west coast of the eastern edge of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, but I educate a lot when I open source, and when I disassemble things, I learn a lot. Okay, but then how do I move beyond that? Okay, and one of the other things that I saw in that process, first of all, eager learners, right, willing to invest in that, willing to buy the latest tools. I remember driving around China around 2001 or 2002. If you wanted a 5-speed automatic transmission in those days, you had to buy a Volkswagen or an Audi or a BMW or something like that. Okay, and then but these days, well, this is before the transition to EVs, around 2010, 2012, you could buy the software that would, do all the NVH analysis on automatic transmissions and give you all the design stuff. So they've invested heavily in design tools. So you're absolutely right. They've moved beyond that. Okay, and if you look at fiber lasers, okay, they're doing some pretty innovative work. There's this new center they just opened outside Beijing, which was it was just written up in Nature about extreme materials. If you want to test this thing at ultra high magnetic field, ultra high temperature, ultra low temperature, all these things. So they're investing like crazy, but they have a much longer view on this stuff. Sometimes they get subsidies. Sometimes I had a student, whose father had a manufacturing company in Shanghai. We were talking about what were his accounts payables. It's like, well, sometimes we have some payables that are out 5 years, and I was talking to this construction group 2 weeks ago, and it's like, oh yeah, this Chinese company really likes doing business with us because we pay them in 30 days. It's like 30 days. It's like, standard terms are like 180 days. Okay, you're paying them in 30. Of course, they think they just died and went to heaven, So, but there's a lot of innovation going on. You should not underestimate that. So it's going to be a tough race.
Thank you for giving me a little bit more time to formalize the question.
That's called a stall. I teach my students that all the time.
This is great. So I guess there are high tech, very important and strategic technologies like lithography, LCDs, etc. There's policy for that. There are making injection molded, coffee stirrers. Maybe we don't care about that. But then there are 3D printers in the middle. Maybe a little bit selfish of me, but like that's in the middle of my world. And what is your prediction? Is China going to innovative entrepreneurs? They are going to stay. Chinese subsidy, is it going to stay or go away? Or is there going to be some foreign policy that is going to change the equilibrium today? Because today it is pretty intense that similar capabilities, similarly to the Yamaha example, are 6x in price difference from each other, or 10, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah. So that's a complicated question. Okay, but one of the things that I've told some people in Washington is like, stand back. Okay, look what China did to entrepreneurs over the last couple of years, right? Stand back and let them do it to themselves, right? You hear about all these sea turtles who went back to establish, companies in China. Do you think any one of them sold their house in the U.S.? You think any one of them gave up their passport if they had I work with people over there. It's like, Nancy, how come you're carrying a Canadian passport? Or, so-and-so, how come you're carrying a UK passport? Oh, just in case. You don't think anybody who had the means that they could get here wouldn't rather be in the US working around MIT or Stanford or something like that? I think that's part of the answer. Okay, it's a hard one to get to politically. But you're absolutely right. We should not underestimate the innovative capacity there because it's kind of a great statistical experiment with all this stuff going up against the wall, and you see what sticks, right? I mean, we definitely see a very Darwinian process over there, and some of the stuff they do is very good.
Thank you.
A lot of it is very good.